So, some piece of shit government website will tell you after the second invasion of Iraq, I quote, "The coalition nations, together with the United Nations, began to work to establish a stable, democratic state of Iraq." Oh, that sounds so nice, but in reality, the U.S. government installed a new puppet regime. Then the media says, I quote, "The Iraqi provisional government began training new Iraqi security forces to police the country, and the U.S. promised them over $20 billion in reconstruction money in credit for Iraq's future oil revenues." In other words, sign over your oil fields and the World Bank credit card company has more money for all the new puppets now in control of Iraq. Then the White House and the U.S. media began all the bullshit about removing the U.S. troops from Iraq by a certain date in 2010, then a certain date in 2011. But the truth is this: the U.S. military was basically in control of Iraq, so they had to stick around for quite some time to program a whole new Iraqi government and their military for the next big plan. And that is this: the U.S. military wants to start a nuclear war and use weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. So the U.S. wants Iraq to go to war with Iran again, this time with both countries possessing nuclear weapons. And my guess is that countries like North Korea and China will back up Iran, and the U.S. will continue to program and equip Iraq and the royal families of the Middle East with more chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction. Because you could read on the internet that the new regime in Iraq prepares to buy $13 billion worth of American arms. They're going to spend $4.2 billion on F-16 warplanes. And I quote, "The Iraq Defense Ministry intends to transform the country's degraded conventional forces into a state-of-the-art military and become among the world's biggest customers for American military arms and equipment. Part of the planned purchase includes tanks, missiles, and laser-guided bombs." And the grand finale: the United Nations has lifted restrictions on Iraq so that Iraq could be allowed to have a civilian nuclear program. So here are the weapons of mass destruction that the U.S. government has been looking for, again supplied by the U.S. military and the Western power establishment to the chaotic war zone of Iraq, a country that has been in upheaval for 3 decades. So, they're a new government with very little experience in the war-torn and chaotic region of Iraq. And the first thing the United States wants to do is give these guys capabilities to build nuclear weapons. In Iraq, there are 7.5 million Kurds. And to recap, in the 90s, the U.S. military encouraged the Kurds to revolt against Saddam during the Kuwait War. Then the U.S. military left Saddam in power and pulled out of Iraq, and Saddam began killing as many Kurds as he could, while President George H.W. Bush refused to intervene, calling it an internal Iraqi affair. Then the U.S. military invaded Iraq again in 2003, where the Kurds were still there, as the largest military force that backed the U.S. military, and made sure the U.S. troops were safe in Kurdish territories. And what did the U.S. do to repay them this time? After the military arrested Saddam's old military regime, the CIA began training this old regime, the old Iraqi army, as a terrorist group that specialized in kidnapping, human trafficking, and oil smuggling. And that became ISIS. And due to their activities, ISIS is extremely well funded and began to attack the Kurds in Syria and Iraq. When ISIS attacked the Kurds in northern Iraq, the new U.S.-trained Iraqi military stood down instead of protecting their northern territories where the Kurds lived. And this was because, of course, the new Iraq government and ISIS are both controlled by the U.S. military. And the U.S. military wanted ISIS to take over Kurdish regions and turn the Kurdish lands into a terrorist state that the Iraqi military and the U.S. could invade later, putting an end to the Kurds. So that is how the U.S. and their new Iraqi puppet government have repaid the Kurds for their support in fighting Saddam and protecting American soldiers. So when ISIS, which is Saddam's old army, invaded northern Iraq, the new Iraqi military fled, leaving the Kurdish militia, called the Peshmerga, to stand up to ISIS. And the Peshmerga fought ISIS and kicked him out of northern Iraq. Now the U.S. wasn't exactly expecting that. And meanwhile, back at Iraq's capital, the U.S. military continued to program their new puppet regime, saying to the press that the U.S. was promoting democracy in Iraq, when all along they did not even allow the Iraqi people to have a vote. And the U.S. military controlled both Iraq's new government and the old one, which is now called ISIS. And ISIS's job is to take over the only free and decent part of Iraq left, and that is the Kurdish territories in northern Iraq. And the new Iraqi army is refusing to help them. Then in economics, the U.S. government is trying to starve the Kurds out by telling everyone not to buy Kurdish oil. They even seized a Kurdish oil tanker that was delivering oil to the U.S. Now the only country that buys oil from the Kurds is Turkey, which withholds 80% of their profits in a Turkish bank because of some Iraqi law. So Turkey is just another piece of shit government, like Syria. And the Syrian government persecutes the Kurds living in Syria as well. The government in Syria denies the Kurds representation in the government. They denied the Kurds the right to free assembly, the right to attend Syrian schools, the right to social programs, and the Syrian government outlaws Kurdish books. So Assad is just another European-controlled piece of shit, just like Putin from Russia, with his shirtless horseback photographs. Putin is not a leader, he is more a gay stable boy. So here are two quotes from the U.S. government-controlled media. Still, the administration, bound to a policy it calls One Iraq, is quietly working to prevent the Kurds' aspirations. American officials are warning companies that buying Kurdish oil may have dire legal consequences, and the warnings have been effective. The Kurdish regional government is nearly bankrupt. U.S. officials say that the Kurds would be better off staying in Iraq and making an agreement with Baghdad to receive their share of the nation's oil revenues. The officials say an oil agreement is impossible as long as the Kurds insist on pursuing independence. Obama has spoken carefully in the public, but it is plain that the administration wants the Kurds to do two potentially incompatible things. The first is to serve as a crucial ally in the campaign to destroy ISIS, with all the military funding and equipment that such a role entails. The second is to resist seceding from the Iraqi state. Around Washington, the understanding is clear. If the long-sought country of Kurdistan becomes real, America's 12-year project of nation building in Iraq will be sundered. End quote. So the U.S. military is there in Kurdish territories with their CIA-controlled ISIS Special Forces group who will attack and try to wear the Kurds down. So the government will, of course, support that war. We're going to send some CIA team of special forces mixed with Saddam's old army in to fight you, but we'll give you some weapons to do it. Meanwhile, the U.S. government is trying to eliminate the Kurds' right to independence by hurting their ability to sell oil. And instead, the U.S. government wants them to accept welfare from the new Iraqi government / World Bank. That way, it will be easy to push the whole country into a war with old enemy Iran. Then the U.S. could provide the Iraqis with more weapons, including a nuclear weapons program at this point, and start a global nuclear war. So the one group that is standing in the U.S. military's way are the Kurds, who always got along well with the Iranians and have fellow Kurds in 4 different Middle Eastern nations. The Kurds are also a people who represent all different religions. It will be easy for the Kurds to make peace with the other Middle Eastern countries instead of going to war. If the U.S. had any real government left, they would support the Kurds by allowing them to sell oil and the right to govern their own sovereign nation. But the people in charge of the U.S. government and the military are a criminal regime focused on starting a nuclear war in the Middle East, which will probably become a World War III scenario with China backing Iran against the Western nations.